Welcome to one more edition of Politics and Right. I'm Egberto Willis, your host. Today we are honored to have Jon Marshall. Who is Jon Marshall? Jon Marshall is an associate professor at the Medill School of Journalism, Media Integrated Marketing and Communications at Northwestern University. He is the author of Watergate's Legacy and the Press, The Investigative Impulse. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic.com. Everybody here watches that, reads that. WashingtonPost.com, Christian Center Monitor, Princess Science Monitor, CBS News, Public Eye, Chicago Tribune, Huffington Post, and many other venues. It is my honor to have you, Dr. Marshall. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Egberto. How are you today?
I am doing great. But I tell you what, normally when I start these interviews, I don't start with a book that you write, but it so happened that this book that you wrote, I think just the title alone is something that it's something that we have to take into account right now. So why don't you tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book and the tenets that you brought out in the book?
Sure. I started on the book back in 2017, soon after Donald Trump was elected president. And we all saw and heard a president who vehemently and consistently attacked journalists, used violent imagery to describe journalists, applauded when a congressional candidate body slammed a journalist, and called journalists enemies of the American people. I wanted to understand how we got to that point in terms of the relationship between presidents and the press, and whether what Donald Trump was doing was completely unprecedented, or were there some precedents for what he was doing, and what were the forces that led to this point?
Now, let me ask you this, because you said whether it was unprecedented or not, or whether it was sort of delivered through some sort of externality, other forces that came out there. What was your thought on that? Was it unprecedented or not?
Well, there are parts of it, what I found from my research, some of it was precedented, some of it wasn't unprecedented. So what was precedented? First, the kind of intense partisanship in the media. We've had that before, particularly in the early years of this country, in the 1790s, early 1800s. I write about John Adams's presidency, and things were just as nasty then as they are now.
Really?
They were, yes. The level of insults, the level of criticism. One thing that was fascinating is the kind of rhetoric around immigration was very similar. That immigrants were bringing in crime, were bringing in disease, were going to be disloyal. They talked about immigrants in the same way in the 1790s, except they were talking about the French,
Irish,
the Germans, and the Irish.
Right.
Different nationalities, same rhetoric. What was also precedented is, Donald Trump was famous for using Twitter as a way to reach his base, to try to motivate his voters. But he was far from the only president to use a new technology to try to go beyond the White House press corps and speak to the public directly. Franklin Roosevelt famously did that with radio in his fireside chats. He got around the publishers. Many publishers hated Franklin Roosevelt, but he got around them through new technology. John F. Kennedy and other presidents used television, and then starting with Obama, and then definitely Donald Trump using social media to do that. So that part was precedented too. Also precedented was Richard Nixon was the first to really come up with the strategy of casting journalists as an enemy. As an enemy that the public should distrust.
Well, let me back up and ask you. You said Nixon was the first one who actually made the press the enemy, not these others.
Right. Every president has complained about the press, has been upset about things in the press, occasionally lashed out at the press. I think they've all done that. But for Nixon, it was a definite strategy. There's in his archives, you can see memos that his chief of staff wrote to him saying, we can make the press a useful enemy. And Nixon wrote, we need to discredit the media. We need to discredit it. So it was a focused strategy that he had. In the end, it didn't work for Nixon. He was forced to resign because of Watergate. But Trump picked up that strategy and then kind of put it on steroids in terms of casting the press as an enemy. So those are things I think were precedented. Some things that were unprecedented about Trump. Every president at least paid some lip service to the idea that a free press is important in the United States.
Right.
The First Amendment is something important. even if they really disliked journalists, they would still say, we need the First Amendment, we need a free press. Trump, nah, no, just the opposite. And Trump was really the first to use violent language about journalists, and the first to make spreading conspiracy theories at the heart of his presidency as part of his media strategy. So I think there were parts of the Trump presidency that was unprecedented, and then there were parts that we've seen in the past in history.
Okay, I want to expand the discussion a bit because my concern here is it is horrendous that Donald Trump made the press the enemy, that Donald Trump attacked the press, that Donald Trump actually put many of the press in danger. However, my question to you with regards to the press has to do now with the accuracy of the press, and isn't it true that to some extent they've laid the groundwork for, if you will, part of the demise of the stature that they would normally have? As an example, Donald Trump, in my humble opinion, would not have become president in the beginning if some of the most ridiculous things he spoke about were treated as such by a press who actually gave it legs. In other words, when we spoke about, let me give one good example, and then for this example, I'd actually like a response. Remember that we had Obama was considered, he was illegitimate because he was born somewhere else. Now, we all know that McCain was born in the country of my birth, Panama, okay? Now, Obama was born of an American mother. Even if you thought he was born in Kenya, it would not have mattered. Obama could be president because just like McCain was a natural born citizen because he was of a mother of an American mother, so would have Obama had been, even if born in Kenya. Yet there's no American that would know that if he's born in Kenya, he was still a legitimate president.
Oh, you're absolutely right about that part. So kind of two-part response to what you say. Yes, journalists, the press, the media makes a lot of mistakes. Everything the media does is by definition public. We see it all, we hear it all,
right.
We read it all. Unlike most other professions, you make a mistake, you're not necessarily going to get caught in it. Journalists get caught, and deservedly so. So I'm not going to say that the press is always perfect about it. And I think the example you give is a great example of when they did a very bad job. And I write about this in the book quite a bit, that Trump spread this lie. It was a lie. It was a false conspiracy that Obama wasn't really a true American, even though his birth certificate proved he was born in Hawaii. There were newspaper announcements, a birth announcement when he was born in the Honolulu newspaper. But yet Trump was able to spread this conspiracy, not just on Fox News, where he went regularly to push it, but on some of the so-called mainstream TV stations. He would go on like Good Morning America and spread it. He's clever about it in that he would say, well, we need to ask the question, or some people are saying, which is a kind of a classical conspiracy theory thing. Well, some people are saying this, so I'm going to talk about it, even though it's demonstrably untrue. And particularly the TV shows he went on did not call him on it, and they continued to have him on their shows because he was good ratings. So they were going for the dollars, they were going for the profits. Trump was famous, they would have him on, he would say these ridiculous conspiracy theories. And sometimes they push back on it, but usually not. And they let him get away with it. And he rode that to the White House.
Now, Dr. Marshall, with staying on that same subject with the Obama thing, is it as an example, I mean, is it a responsibility of the press to go the next step? In other words, you point out the fact that you stated that, yes, we could find his birth certificate. Yes, we could find all that information. But the fact that he was born of an American mother made not whether he was born in Kenya or not moot. It made it a moot point. But the press didn't go that extra step to say, even if, should they do that? And I can bring some other examples as we look at inflation today and how prices have gone up. Did they say that, but we're starting from a negative position? In other words, during the pandemic, we started from a negative position, and thus the absolute growth looks like inflation is more than it is. Things like that concerns me, that it has political effects on our system but it's not accurate reporting that does it. So your answer.
So I do think some of the press did point out the fact that you did about his mother, but I think it got buried in the stories and didn't get enough attention. So I'm going to mostly agree with you about that. And I think what your point about inflation is, I think one bias a lot of the media has, a lot of the press has, is toward the negative, towards conflict. The press tends to look for conflict because that's more dramatic. So there's more drama to talk about the problems with inflation, which are very real, less drama to talk about, oh, wages have gone up, unemployment has gone way down, the deficit is going down. So there's a focus on the bad news rather than the good parts of what's going on. So I think the press does a bad job of sometimes getting the complexity of what's going on. And I think they also focus on the whole, not all reporters, but a lot of them focus a lot on sort of the horse race aspect of politics.
Right.
Which candidate's up, which candidate's down.
Right.
How is this policy going to affect the midterm elections? Or how is this policy going to affect Joe Biden winning or not winning in 2024, rather than what does this policy mean for different Americans or different people around the world? What are the advantages of this policy, disadvantages? What are some of the complexities of it? There's some of that reporting, but I think it tends to get drowned out by the drama of that political horse race reporting.
Now, based on your research, because empirically I can say certain things, but I imagine you've done some studies. How influential is the press, and how much has the press changed what would have otherwise occurred?
No, that's a great question. There are studies about how the press has the ability to kind of set the agenda in terms of what issues people talk about, and it also has the power to frame the issue, to kind of what we were just talking about, what to include in the story, what to leave out of the story. There were some studies done that after birth of Fox News, that people who listened to Fox News were several percentage points more likely to vote Republican than before they had listened to Fox News, as one example of how press or the media can sway people politically. So it's going to depend a little bit from outlet to outlet in terms of how much difference it makes, and it probably varies from person to person. But on the whole, how the press, what stories the press covers, and then again how they frame it does indeed make a difference, as you suggest.
No, I remember being in Washington, D.C. in the old days during a Tea Party protest, and we came with Build a Dream, and we had several thousand people that came to build the dream, right? And we had about, maybe a few dozen Tea Partiers, and when we saw the news that day, we had a slight mention of Barber. And it was as if Washington was controlled by the Tea Party in those days. How much responsibility should the press take for issues like that?
That's another really good example. I write about in the book how the Tea Party was really an offshoot of Fox News, an offshoot of a lot of talk radio show hosts. The Tea Party was really kind of nothing at the start. It was one guy on a rant. The Fox
I remember that on Fox,
promoted it, and Fox News personalities would lead Tea Party rallies, and the same with some of the conservative talk radio hosts as well. So that was a case where at least some elements of the press were pushing this ideological position. And I think a lot of the rest of the press is sort of guilty of sort of responding to that and saying, oh, we've got to cover that equally to what Obama is doing, so we're going to give the Tea Party equal coverage. And I'm one who, you're just saying that Reverend Barber, as I understand it,
yes,
held a rally the same day. I admit that I was unfamiliar with that. So that's a good case where the coverage of what he was doing did not get equal time.
Well, it's interesting because he has a group called the Poor Man's Campaign, and it's a great multicultural group. It looks like America, and they are out there doing a lot of things throughout the country. And there are ones that are really supporting a large, as you know, the stats tells us about America right now. They are actually supporting what a majority of the population wants. And I'll be darned, I don't see them in the news. So my next question is, how much, I understand that it's wrong for a lot of folks to deal with the media the way they deal. That's why we have independent media. But I mean, it is kind of interesting that we don't see the coverage of things that matter to, let's say, 70% of the population. And if you look at you go to a White House news conference, and I listen to them every day, and you go to a White House news conference, it doesn't cover 90% of the things that really is references the everyday person.
Yeah. I think on the whole, the press does not do a good job of covering poverty and issues for working class people. One of the things that happened during the first year of the Biden administration is that the child poverty went down significantly.
Yes.
Went down.
Yes.
We didn't hear a lot about that. We heard a lot more about corporate tax cuts and so forth. And one of the suggestions I have in the last chapter of my book of Clash, where I make some recommendations for the future, is that I think the White House press corps needs to circulate more, not just stay inside Washington, but spend time.
Doctor, let me stop you there, because that is how I really want to end with solutions, because I think that is exactly what we need. So before you get into solutions, sorry for interrupting there, I'd like to ask you about do you see any backstories for the reasons why things that matter, let's say like environment, which is a very what's the word that I want to use? Whatever, it's very important right now for our survival, doesn't have the coverage relative to its importance to society at large.
So why is that the case?
Yes, is it? I have a contention that we have too much, that the media is a part of this capitalist system, if you will, and as such, it also depends on the same corporations that it may have to speak out against. Is there any validity to that?
I think there's some validity to that. A large portion of the media is controlled by large corporations. And I think there may be instances when reporters are pressured not to cover something. On the other hand, I've worked in a lot of newsrooms, and I know that every reporter I worked with was most interested in getting a good story and finding out what was going on. Not that we were perfect about it. And I never had a case where an editor or a publisher told me not to do a story. I think part of it is that climate change is reported on. It's out there, but I think it's also it's complicated, and it's easier to tell those kind of short horse race stories than it is to try to explain what's going on with climate change. And I think it also gets into what we talked a little bit about earlier. Climate change most affects people living in poorer countries right now, and I think we have very weak global coverage. And in the United States, the people who are most affected, by and large, are people who live in less advantaged communities. Those are the people who get hammered the most when there's a hurricane or when there's flooding or when there's fires and droughts. It tends to be those neighborhoods. So I think it's back to a little bit to too many journalists coming from the middle or wealthier classes and not paying attention to people who are living in poverty or people who are barely making it in the economy.
Is there any possibility of some self-censorship as well, knowing who pays the bills?
I think there's some possibility of that. I think there's some examples of that. But again, my experience is that what journalists are most interested in is beating their competition and getting a story. We're very competitive. I once punched a hole in a wall when the competitor
somebody gets it before you, right?
On a story that I should have had. We want to beat the competition. So part of it, there is kind of a group think, I think, like if your competitors are covering one thing, then you're going to try to outdo them on that one thing. And you see that, I think, in Washington all the time. They get focused on one story. Don't think about the broader picture.
All right, let's end it this way. I have, and it ends with two questions. First of all, please give me some solutions, number one. And I'm going to tag this one along because I don't want to kind of put it on the side. Tell me what you would have liked me to ask you that I didn't. And if you see any one of my interviews, that's always my last questions, my brother.
Okay, that's great. That's usually my last question when I'm out reporting too. So
all right, great.
I love it. So I do suggest several solutions in my book. One, I think, gets at some of the things that you've been bringing up is more support for nonprofit journalism. There are some excellent examples of nonprofit journalism around the country, but it's not as big of a sector as the for-profit journalism. ProPublica is probably the best investigative reporting site good out there now. They're a nonprofit. There's a number of sort of traditional established newspapers that have switched to nonprofit status. In my own city, Chicago, the Chicago Sun-Times is now allied with the local public radio station and has gotten nonprofit status. But as I understand it, the tax laws are really difficult to navigate to do that. It's really complicated. And they don't make it easy to become a nonprofit. So I think that's something that could be done to make that easier. I think a huge part of the revenue that comes from digital advertising goes to two places, Facebook and Google. Last stat I saw was 3/5 of the digital advertising dollars are going to those two companies.
Wow.
Australia passed a law that when Facebook or Google or any other social media company uses news content that somebody else created, and that's what they do. The people will post the news from elsewhere, and then people see it on Facebook. Facebook sells ads from that. So Australia has a law that if Facebook or any other company uses news that someone else created, guess what? They have to pay for it. There has to be a fee that goes to the people who did the reporting to get that information. And I think if there's additional revenue for reporting, we're going to get deeper and more diverse story as a result. So those are two of the suggestions I would have. I've got many.
A ton more, folks. To get the rest of his suggestions, go get the book, which is going to be along with the blog, and you can just do it as you listen to the show as well. Continue, my friend.
And then I think a question I wish you'd ask me is what can we all, as citizens, as voters, as members of the public, as consumers of media do? I think we all have a responsibility to become savvier about what we're consuming, understand how social media algorithms work, to try to push and promote the most incendiary content, the most controversial content, rather than necessarily the most factual content. There's a stat in my book that in the April of 2020, the first big month of COVID, that sites from the 10 leading health websites got 70 million views. Sites from the 10 leading conspiracy sites about COVID got 300 million, four times as many. So we need to become smarter about how that works. And I think that media literacy needs to be taught in the schools. I think media literacy is a basic skill now, like algebra or poetry. Media saturates our lives. We're bombarded with it, and we need to understand how to sort through what's propaganda and what's real information, what's verified information, what's not verified, how advertisers are trying to work us, manipulate us, how those algorithms work, and just really understand what it is that we're consuming, so we can be able to sort through the disinformation and get to the facts.
Dr. Jon Marshall, Associate Professor at the Medill School of Journalism and the author of Clash, Presidents and the Press in Times of Crisis. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Thank you, Berto. Thank you very much for having me.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.